Hey, I'm glad you're here because what happened in the last 48 hours is going to change everything you thought you knew about the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. While the world was looking the other way, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse was playing out in the dark, choppy waters of the Atlantic. You're looking at a man who thought he could leave his secrets behind in the Bahamas, a former Marine who claimed his wife simply bounced off a boat and vanished. But the U.S. Coast Guard just delivered a masterclass in justice. They didn't just find the boat, they seized it, they hooked it, and they dragged it back to American soil in the middle of a brutal storm. This isn't just a vessel anymore. It's a 46-foot steel trap, and for Brian Hooker, the walls are finally closing in. For weeks, we've been watching the Soulmate float aimlessly in Marsh Harbor. It sat there like a ghost, a silent witness to whatever happened on that final night. Brian was gone, back in the States, acting like a man who had moved on, while Lynette's mother and daughter were left with nothing but a void. But Brian made a mistake. He's a former Marine, a man who knows how to mask his location, or so he thought. He hired delivery captains to sneak that boat out of the Bahamas and bring his asset back to him. He wanted his toy back. He wanted the evidence under his control. But here's the thing about the ocean. It doesn't have many places to hide when the United States Coast Guard Investigative Services are breathing down your neck. I've been tracking this boat like a dog with a bone. We had eyes on it the moment it moved from its mooring ball. We watched as Brian's hired hands provisioned it with fuel and food, preparing for a 24-hour crossing. They thought they were being slick. They turned off the AIS, the marine tracking system, right out of the harbor. Boop. Gone. Just like Lynette. It's a classic Brian move, isn't it? Masking the location, staying in the shadows. But he didn't realize we were still watching through crowdsourced sailing apps, following the vector as it turned north into the Gulf Stream. Imagine being one of those delivery captains. You're 40 miles offshore, the sky's turning black, and a massive storm is rolling in. You think you're just doing a job, moving a boat for a guy with a complicated past? Then, out of the crashing waves and the howling wind, the cherries start flashing. The Coast Guard didn't just ask them to pull over. They interceded with the kind of force you only see in movies. We're talking about aircraft overhead and cutters like the Robert Yared and the Winslow Greaser flanking them in a storm that would make the perfect storm look like a bathtub. They boarded that boat in the middle of the chaos. Can you imagine the look on their faces when they realized this wasn't just a routine check? The Coast Guard told them, "We are seizing this vessel." They hooked it up and began the long, agonizing tow into Fort Pierce, Florida. Seeing those images of the Soulmate tied to the side of a Coast Guard response boat, being escorted in like a prisoner, it's the next best thing to seeing Brian Hooker himself in handcuffs. Brian thought he was shopping for delivery captains, but he was actually shopping for his own downfall. I found out he was being turned down left, right, and center. Local captains in the Bahamas knew the lore. They knew the smell of something rotten. They wouldn't touch that boat with a 10-foot pole. But he found someone, and those people led the authorities straight to the prize. Now, the Soulmate is sitting in a secure facility in Fort Pierce. It's being reamed. Every inch of that master bathroom, every fiber in the master cabin, every digital log on the Starlink router, it's all being picked apart by the best forensic minds in the country. Brian says she fell. He says the wind took her. But if he's telling the truth, why did the Coast Guard find it necessary to scramble an entire fleet to stop that boat from reaching him? What is hiding in the master bathroom that Brian was so desperate to get back to his own dock? We're about to find out, and the digital ghost she left behind is screaming louder than he ever anticipated. So why would a former Marine, a man trained to survive in the most hostile environments on Earth, just stand there and watch his wife disappear? That's the question everyone is asking, and the more you look at Brian Hooker's story, the more the foundation starts to crumble. Brian told the Bahamian authorities that on that dark night of April 4th, the weather turned, the waves got unpredictable, and Lynette just fell. He says she had the boat keys in her pocket, so when she hit the water, the engine died. He claims he watched her swimming toward the shore, but the current was too strong, and he was left alone to paddle for hours in the dark. But let's look at the marine logic here. You're a trained veteran. Your wife goes overboard. Do you really just watch her swim away? Even without an engine, a man of his background doesn't just lose sight of a person in a narrow channel unless there is a reason for it. And then there's the timing. Lynette vanished around 7:30 p.m., but the authorities weren't notified until 4 a.m. the next morning. That is an 8-hour gap. 8 hours where Brian was alone with his thoughts and his boat. But here's where the digital ghost comes in. Brian didn't realize that in 2026, you can't just turn off the world. The Soulmate was equipped with Starlink, and every device on that boat leaves a footprint. While Brian was telling the police that Lynette was lost at sea by 8 p.m., forensic data suggests a different reality. Internal logs from the boat's network show activity from Lynette's devices. her phone, her watch, well after the time he says she was gone. If she was in the water, why was her digital life still breathing inside that cabin? And then we have the mystery of the second sailboat. Investigators are now scouring the Bahamas for a specific vessel that was moored right next to the Soulmate in Aunt Pat's Bay that day. Why? Because witnesses are starting to talk. People are coming forward saying they heard things. They saw a different version of Brian that day. The story Brian is telling is about a tragic accident, but the evidence being pulled from that boat right now is telling a story of a calculated exit. He thought he was safe because there was no body, no crime, but he forgot that a boat can talk. The GPS doesn't lie, and neither does a heart rate monitor that's still pulsing when it's supposed to be at the bottom of the ocean. Brian's story isn't just leaking, it's sinking. Let's talk about what happens when a crime scene is mobile. Most investigators are used to a static room, walls that don't move, floors that stay level. But the Soulmate is a 46-foot sanctuary that Brian Hooker tried to turn into a black hole. Now that the U.S. Coast Guard has it in Fort Pierce, the sanctuary is being stripped down to the marrow. And let me tell you, what they are looking for isn't just blood. It's the things Brian forgot to throw away. If you believe Brian, Lynette fell off a tiny dinghy in the middle of a cascade of failures. She was swept away by a current he couldn't fight. But if that's true, then everything she was wearing that night should be at the bottom of the Sea of Abaco. Her navy blue headscarf, her aquamarine bathing suit cover-up, and that powder pink Apple Watch, all gone, right? Well, here's the problem for Brian. We know the Apple Watch is in custody. We know she had a habit of taking it off around dinner time to charge it. If that watch was on the boat's charger while Brian was busy telling the world she drowned in a black bikini, he's got a massive problem. Because it means she made it back to the Soulmate. It means the dinghy accident was a fairy tale told to buy him 8 hours of cleanup time. I want you to imagine the investigators entering that master bathroom. They aren't just looking with their eyes, they're using luminol. This chemical doesn't care if you used bleach. It doesn't care if you scrubbed until your hands bled. If there was a struggle, if Brian's history of choking allegations finally reached a breaking point below deck, the walls will glow. We've heard the stories from Lynette's friends and her mother. Photos of bruises on her back. Allegations that Brian had his hands around her neck before. He was never charged back then, but the Soulmate might finally hold him accountable. Think about it. Why would a man be so desperate to hire delivery captains to sneak his boat out of the Bahamas just as the investigation intensified? You don't flee with a 46-foot sailboat unless that sailboat is carrying the only thing that can put you in a cage. And let's not forget the digital ghost. In 2026, every Starlink router keeps a log. If Lynette's phone connected to that Wi-Fi at 8:12 p.m., 30 minutes after Brian says she was swallowed by the ocean, the case is over. That's not a cascade of failures. That's a murder. Investigators are currently reaming that boat for every ounce of forensic and digital evidence. They are looking for that headscarf. They are looking for the cover-up. And if they find them in that master cabin, Brian Hooker's unpredictable seas are going to turn into a life sentence. So here we are, May 2026, and the perfect narrative Brian Hooker tried to build is officially in pieces. He thought that by leaving the Bahamas and letting his lawyer do the talking, he could just fade into the background while the ocean kept his secrets. But the U.S. Coast Guard and the FBI don't just move on. By seizing the Soulmate and bringing it into Florida, they've turned his sanctuary into a forensic vault that he can no longer access. Think about the history we've uncovered. This isn't just about one bad night in April. We are looking at a man who, according to court records and his own family, has a terrifying history of hands around the neck. We know about the 2005 case where he was accused of choking his own daughter until her feet left the floor, all over a homework argument. We know about the 2015 reports from Lynette herself, claiming he'd choked her until she saw black. Brian was never convicted back then, but the pattern is screaming at us now. His daughter, Carly, said it best. It doesn't add up. Her mother was a sailor. She was a swimmer. She wasn't the kind of woman who just bounces off a dinghy and lets a current take her without a fight. And then there's the key. Brian says Lynette had the boat keys in her pocket. Carly's response? Brian is always driving. In 25 years, he was the one in charge of that key. So why did it suddenly end up in her pocket the moment she supposedly fell? The truth is likely hidden in those 8 hours of silence between 7:30 p.m. and 4 a.m. While Brian claims he was paddling for his life, the data from the Soulmate's internal systems is painting a picture of a man who was very busy, not paddling but cleaning. The 2026 update suggests that the digital ghost of Lynette's devices stayed active long enough to prove she was still on that boat when he said she was gone. The U.S. authorities are building a no-body homicide case, a strategy that has put many men just like Brian behind bars. They have the boat. They have the history of violence. They have the digital logs. And most importantly, they have a family that will never stop fighting for Lynette. Brian thought he could sail away from his past, but he forgot one thing. You can't outrun the truth when it's docked in a U.S. impound lot. Lynette Hooker isn't just a missing person anymore. She is the reason a 46-foot sailboat is now a prison for the man who thought he was its master. We aren't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. Justice is coming, and it's wearing a Coast Guard uniform.